I'll tell you where a lot of organizations can miss the mark. They can think that they're getting the voice of the employee by sending out a sentiment survey or something like that. The thing about quantitative research is that it assumes what qualitative research does when you can get someone in there who has a non-stake, such as a consultant, who can come in and actually just ask the questions based on a framework of understanding. It's going to come out in enough volume that it's going to rise to the surface. We were looking at this monkey, but it's really this monkey that is going to sink the implementation.
So what was interesting is when I looked back and speaking to them on their CRM model, there were spikes and valleys in terms of learning, understanding, and overall adoption in terms of the depth of the adoption for that specific system. What the concerns arose from that was in saying, how do we know that we're going to get the support from senior management and ensuring that there's equal footing in terms of our understanding, because they're pushing hard on the gas pedal for us to move the needle. There are people that are going to understand this a little better than other people, and you're going to start seeing these peaks and valleys again, right? That's somewhat natural. It's embedded in kind of our human element. So it gave benefit to the overall group on how one individual has seen better success in what it is that they're doing. So everybody's got an opportunity to learn from the person.
Yeah, you learn from the best case. It's like the project that I did with the top performer. Does the organization have performers that are not as productive? Absolutely. And we know what that issue is. What we didn't know is how these top performers showed up in such a way that made them within the same exact environment more successful. Was it behavior? What we found about these particular individuals is that they were high self-monitors. So it wasn't that they didn't feel fear, overwhelm, stress, occasional burnout even. It's that they were aware and they could apply tools. So you apply that to an implementation of AI. It's that awareness of, oh, I feel like I'm about to be erased.
Mm-hmm.
And sitting with that as an executive team and saying, okay, how do we engage in ethical AI where we know ourselves how this is going to improve and make better versus erase? Do we need to get real? Do we need to understand that, say you're working in a call center, your bottom level entry part of this call center will be replaced until you get to a certain point. Let's put the rewind on this and apply this to something that's already happened.
Yeah.
Phone trees, right? There was an elimination there of a human role by a technology.
Yep. I mean, as there has been over history, it's just there's sort of natural evolution of things. And I think that's probably the most base case argument from senior leadership. We've got to constantly improve. We're always looking to compete better, to differentiate. The challenge for people in the AI space is that they don't know what success looks like.
Yeah.
So there's no measurement of what success looks like. When you're working with a large language model and developing different tools and skills with it, what makes one person do better with it than another? And that really is measured by the organization within the group using it on a broad democratized level, right? They gather back around, they look at each other and they say, hey, this is what we were able to do, or this is what I created. This is the new marketing plan. How did you do that? You share the creative process of how it's being worked. It also gives you a definition of how it is that you're using it ethically, whether or not you're getting outside of the bounds, and you have a mechanism by which you can create some framework around how you use the tools. But going back to how you measure success on this implement is a lot more difficult than being able to say, Susan over here on that CRM system has been able to flesh out all these different tools that come with it, where Tom over there is just entering notes and demographic data.
And I think that when you look at business unit, even drill down to the individual, everyone has a different idea of what it is to win for them. To create that shared vision and build up that mental model of winning and moving forward in the same direction, those conversations need to be had. You can assume and measure your assumption, But if you don't know that, having those open conversations and having that environment for those open conversations is absolutely essential, because you're not going to know how that department or how that individual could sink this change.
Quantitative, it really is just a measurement of behavior.
Yeah.
Right? Out of the qualitative aspects of the organization. And it's just a measurement of the qualitative aspects. And if your input, the adage goes, you crap input, you get crap output, right? If the input
Exactly.
in your quality elements are not particularly strong, I would expect you wouldn't see good quantifiable numbers. Although there are cases where you do, as you probably know, going into organizations and realizing that somehow these quantitative measures are decent, but when you actually dig into how it is that they're pushing out the numbers, the culture of the organization is absolutely abhorrent.
Absolutely. And not just the culture of the organization as stated, the culture of the organization as practiced, because the writing on the wall sometimes isn't the action on the floor.
Absolutely.
The executive level could think that they have this culture and we are so aligned with our values. When you do an assessment, you understand if you have alignment in that organization, if you don't have alignment, what, if anything, the replacement values are. And how those are going to affect the change. If you believe that you have a culture of innovation, for example, but you have idea risk,
Yeah. Yeah.
you don't have a culture of
No,
innovation.
no, no. Yeah. It's
No,
because there's a large healthcare system here that it underscores exactly what you're saying. And the dichotomy of saying one thing and doing another.
absolutely. And I find in healthcare organizations in particular, there's a recency effect that goes on because situations are constantly changing and evolving very quickly. Because you are in direct contact with that patient. And there are very rapidly evolving emotions, very rapidly evolving present drift to the top of the priority list needs. All of those things can change. And I meet with the CEO of a behavioral health system every week. And every week we talk about how the priorities of the organization and the executive priorities align or how they misalign.
Yeah.
And we talk a lot about system mentality in healthcare organizations and how you create a health system over health silos, how you get that health system to work together and rely on itself as a knowledge base versus having a health silo operate within its four walls reactively on what is changing moment to moment.
Right.
How can we leverage across? So we talk a lot about that. And that also comes down to that willingness or resistance to change and the perception of talking across the aisle being a risk. That's cultural, and the ability for that culture to be translated down to that bottom line. It can sink change or it can make change amazing because you have created this collaborative culture that things happen in a good way.
Yeah, I think this creates a natural segue into what a lot of the nursing schools and even secondary schools are doing to condition students to understand the aspects of cultural impact. Quite frankly, I don't see where a lot of that's being implemented. We're pushing down the gas pedal on qualitative aspects in terms of output, but not necessarily in terms of individual character, those elements that are important to enact change in an organization.
From a learning standpoint, psychological safety starts within self. Every person brings themselves to work. And the ability to feel safe with themselves for speaking up for their needs, for saying when they need help, they bring that into the workplace. That can be impacted by the environment that they enter, but not just the environment as a whole, but, and this is a topic covered in my dissertation, that dyadic one-on-one psychological safety and the trust built with the individual leading them can be taught and brought up. What they walked in with, they can be brought up to a baseline of, okay, I can trust this person here. And then that can spider out to the coworkers within that department. What's interesting is that independent of this dyadic relationship, an organization itself can have a certain culture if that leader is able to hold the line and hold the relationship in the safe container with the employee. Change can occur when you have this psychological safety set up within this pod or this dyad. It's why if you've seen organizations where it worked really great in this business unit, but in this business unit, it was a total mess.
Yep.
And it comes down to that ability for those relationships to hold that disclosure environment, which minimizes that risk. That is a teaching aspect that could be taught in schools and in leadership programs, is how do you go about doing that if someone has never had it for themselves, or if they have any resistances, how to move through those resistances.
It also brings on culture in a more magnanimous type of situation where you start looking at culture within the United States. We've lived in 4 states. So culturally, how business is conducted in Texas now for almost 4 years is different than what we experienced in Arizona and Washington. In terms of how organizations are internally, how they operate, I've seen significant differences in the culture of organizations from one state to the next. And when you're referring to this dyadic safety or this net around it, you can see these anomalous sports teams where statistically they have no reason to make it to, in my case, the Stanley Cup, like Edmonton Oilers, for example. And the reason being is you have a very strong gelled team that works exceptionally well together. And by virtue of that, they have been able to teams that have statistically performed better. The challenge being is that when you start looking at some of these teams within the larger dynamic of multiple teams, and then you've got overarching senior leadership with whom doesn't recognize the importance of that specific team because their objectives are around being able to meet a metric, and they don't recognize that they need to be considerate of how to use what they have to reach that objective. I've seen where it's difficult to correct because senior leadership doesn't recognize the mistake they're trying to drive.
And it's not at all intentional. It's not at all malicious. It's basically, there's a desire there, just knowing that critical piece of information. I'll ask you the same question. What does it look like for you? What does it look like when you win?
What does it look like for me when I win?
Yeah.
When I see a collective group of people, it'll depend on who it is that I'm working with and understanding what the objectives are of the folks with whom have hired me, if this is the context with which it is you're referring. So I want to see that I've been able to bridge the gap, if there is any, between senior leadership and the team they're trying to empower to reach a specific set of objectives. And that I feel most passionately in my win when I recognize that the team that I'm working with on a collective basis feels that sense in terms of what it is that they've been able to get out from the instruction. Because by virtue of that, and I don't mean to use this word frivolously, but I have then a way of being able to market that back to senior leadership and saying, here's what it is. We had initially a group of people, let's say 10 or a dozen, with very diverse and unique, nuanced feelings about what we're going to do here. And whether or not you recognize that, and senior leadership, I ran an organization, you look at it as being, well, that's just people. Diane's going to be different than Erron. Francis is going to be different than Tom. If you don't know and can't recognize what it looks like to build a cohesive unit, your definition of cohesive may be different than what cohesive actually is. Then a misstep in terms of what it is you're trying to achieve. And when I walk out and I feel like I've got 10 or 12 people that are working together and they're helping each other out, I can go back to senior leadership and say, here's what's different today with your organization than what it was before we had an opportunity to get involved.
What can stand between you and that win?
Usually, the biggest difference is where senior leadership is not committed to seeing the need for a unified understanding from their staff in terms of what the change is going to do for the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you'll have an individual in the organization that will hold out irrespective of what it is that you're trying to do. Then you really have to start having questions as to whether or not the right folks in the boat. But generally speaking, it really comes down to sponsorship.
Yeah. It's built by people and it's often not inquired into in that way. People aren't used to being asked. They're used to being voluntold. I think that it changes the whole landscape of change when you start with that involvement piece. When we worked with the Fortune 500 restaurant chain and worked with them on the very large capital initiative implementation that involved their franchisees and involved all of their employees in a certain area of the restaurant, having those conversations and facilitating those discussions, understanding fears and resistances, and who are the holdouts going to be, and why are there holdouts? Where do they go in the change line? If there's holdouts, they're obviously not going to be the first ones you're going to put in line for the change. You're going to phase them out.
What conditions gave rise to them being a holdout?
Exactly. What can
Thomas, no way. I've been down this road before. I know where this is going to go. And you've got a new leader trying to push the needle, but he can't get it done. Tom has already been hit by previous bad change.
And you have this mental model that's in place of the myth of past experience. In the book, The Fifth Discipline, Peter Senge really goes into these mental models that hold us back from living. The myth of past experience has killed more change than anything because there is this fear based on what has gone wrong in the past or what couldn't be affordable in the past. And it informs the present. If you just look at it as variables, take the emotion, take the situations out of it, you're dealing with XY, not XX. You're not dealing with yesterday's environments, people, systems, and processes in today's situation. So back to your focus on AI, we're dealing with a completely new technology. We're dealing with something that has had mimics in the past, like the auto dialer, even chatbots, right? So you have people who have previous experience and are applying their fear from this over here and uprooting that, having those discussions, closing those gaps can bring a person around. I was working with an executive who did not want to retire and not seeing the benefits of retirement for them, but needing to retire. And once a conversation was had around their desires and tapping into a desire for contribution and meaningful work, an accord was reached where this person became an advisor. They staged out of their role, but became an advisor to a new person who could move that organization forward in ways that this particular leader could not. But there was institutional knowledge within this leader and an ability to inform the organization that this new person did not have. So having this advisor role, having this ability to inform the organization as a whole in a different way actually created more purpose for that person, added more value to the organization than keeping them in that role. That person would have been canceled out because there was no role for them in that current piece. These conversations are important to have, but they're often very hard to have because of that risk of speaking up. If I speak up, if I say the wrong thing, I'm going to lose my job. I'm not going to be able to hold my emotion. I'm not going to be able to perform the way I perceive I should perform. This reflexive loop is going on in here saying this is how I should be, maintain the streak. Meanwhile, the data is being suppressed. And once we free the data, we free the organization.
Right.
Free the data and then make it actually operational.
Yeah, that's a challenge.
I like a challenge.